Okay, so you want to get married. Not the marriage part, you already decided that. The wedding part. The one day. The dress, the flowers, the toast. You call a florist. You describe the arrangement. White roses, eucalyptus, 6 centerpieces. She quotes you $1,200. Reasonable, you think. Then you mention one word. It's for my wedding. The quote doesn't change on paper. But somewhere between event and wedding, the number in your head just moved. In 2016, Consumer Reports tested this for real. Secret shoppers, 5 metro areas, identical requests. One caller said anniversary party. Another said wedding. 28% of vendors quoted a different price for the exact same service. Same flowers, same hours, same food. A higher number for one word. That's not the whole story. That's just the hook. Because the real machine behind that flower quote is bigger, older, and far more organized than a florist having a bad day. Hold on to that quote. $1,200. One word. No explanation. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why it happened, who benefits from it happening at scale 2 million times a year, and why the florist, honestly, isn't even the one you should be looking at. Here's the picture in your head. A wedding is one purchase. One big day, one big check, one vendor who basically runs the whole thing while you show up and say your vows. Here's the number that breaks that picture. In 2025, roughly 2 million couples got married in the United States. Together, they spent an estimated $66.16 billion on weddings that year alone, a market larger than the entire global box office. The average wedding cost $32,899 to $34,200, depending on whose survey you trust. But averages lie, and this one lies in a specific direction. The median, the number where half of couples spent more and half spent less, was $18,231. Less than $18,231 for half the country's weddings, while the average headline sits nearly twice as high. That gap exists because a small slice of extremely expensive weddings, Manhattan events running past $96,000, New Jersey averages above $54,000, drag the mean upward, while most couples are quietly spending a fraction of the number reporters like to print. So the illusion isn't just that weddings are expensive. The illusion is that the wedding industry is one industry at all, a single, coordinated machine you hire once and let run. And the industry isn't shrinking. U.S. wedding services were valued at roughly $65 billion in 2024 and are projected to reach $95.35 billion by 2030, a 6.8% annual growth rate. Even as the American marriage rate itself keeps declining, projected to fall to just 5.6 marriages per 1,000 people by 2026. That's the paradox sitting underneath the whole category. Fewer people are choosing to get married, and the dollars spent on each one who does keeps climbing anyway. Fewer transactions, higher revenue per transaction, which is exactly the kind of math that rewards consolidation, not competition. Part of that growth comes from a genuinely different place. Rising diversity is expanding what a standard wedding even includes. Multicultural and interfaith weddings, multi-day South Asian celebrations, Hispanic weddings built around live music and specific traditions, Jewish ceremonies with their own required rituals, are adding entirely new categories of specialized vendors to the spending stack, on top of the traditional venue caterer photographer core. That's real cultural value being added, not just markup. But from a market's perspective, it's also just more line items, more vendors, more contracts, more surface area for the same information gap to repeat itself. The reality: it's 12 to 15 separate small businesses, each with its own contract, its own deposit schedule, its own cancellation policy, and zero obligation to talk to each other. A venue, a caterer, a photographer, a florist, a DJ or band, a hair and makeup team, a dress shop, a jeweler, a stationery designer, a transportation company, an officiant. In most cases, nobody is coordinating these vendors except you. Two people who, statistically, are buying every one of these services for the first and only time in their lives, negotiating against professionals who sell the exact same service every single weekend of the season. That asymmetry is the entire industry in miniature. And it explains something the geography confirms on its own. The same average American wedding costs $54,500 in New Jersey and $17,380 in Utah, roughly 3 times the price for what gets marketed as the identical product. The venue alone typically eats 24 to 40% of the total budget, somewhere between $8,500 and $14,300, just for a room, some tables, and access to a kitchen you don't own. None of that is illegal. None of it is even unusual for a fragmented services market. But it means the couple walking into their first vendor meeting is the least informed person in every single conversation they're about to have, and they're about to have 12 of them. Look at how the number gets built per person instead of per event, and the picture sharpens further. The average American wedding in 2025 had somewhere between 122 and 132 guests, and couples spent roughly $292 per guest, up $8 from the year before. Multiply that out and the one big purchase starts to look a lot more like buying a small event venue's worth of catering, seating, and service, price per head, the same way a conference or a corporate gala would be priced. Except nobody calls a wedding a corporate gala, and nobody budgets for it like one. The generational split makes the illusion even clearer. Gen Z couples spend an average of $27,000 on their wedding. Millennials spend $38,000. Gen X couples spend $23,000, and $15,000 spread between generations getting married under the exact same industry, the same venues, the same platforms. 59% of couples in 2025 said the economy directly affected their wedding budget, and 40% responded by cutting their guest list. Nobody cut the venue, the platform fee, or the per guest markup. They cut the people. Let's build the cost the way it actually gets built, not as one number, but as a stack of separate decisions, each one closing a door behind you. First barrier, the calendar. Weddings cluster into a 6-month season, April through October, concentrated even further onto Saturdays. In 2025, 71% of couples stretched their celebration across 2 to 3 days. A rehearsal dinner, a welcome party, the wedding itself, a post-wedding brunch, which means each couple is now consuming multiple calendar slots from the same pool of vendors chasing the same 26 Saturdays a year. A photographer, a venue, a band. Each of them has exactly one product to sell on any given Saturday in June, and once that Saturday passes unsold, the revenue is gone forever. That scarcity is priced in before you ever pick up the phone. Second barrier, the wedding-specific quote itself. Go back to that 2016 Consumer Reports test. An Atlanta photographer quoted nearly double for what the reporters called an almost identical package of services. A hotel in St. Louis added more than $8,000 in fees that only appeared once the word wedding entered the conversation. A New York restaurant priced an unspecified banquet at $55 a head, and the identical off-season wedding at $125 a head. A separate test by Vox called the same caterer twice, $15,000 for a generic event, $17,000 for a wedding. A $2,000 gap that existed entirely inside one word. Vendors will tell you, correctly, that weddings genuinely require more hours on site, more coordination with a dozen other contractors, more liability if a single piece fails on a day that cannot be redone. That's a real cost. It's also, conveniently, a cost that's nearly impossible for a couple to verify from the outside, because you have no second wedding to compare the invoice against, and the vendor has hundreds. And there's an entire parallel barrier stacked on top of the domestic one, leaving the country to avoid it. Destination weddings have become their own multi-billion-dollar sub-industry, growing from roughly $36 billion globally in 2024 to an estimated $47.7 billion in 2025, a 31.7% annual growth rate that outpaces almost every other segment of the wedding economy. North America is the largest single region driving that number. Couples chase destination weddings partly for the experience, and partly on the belief that leaving the domestic vendor market means leaving the domestic markup behind. In practice, it usually means trading one set of intermediaries, local caterers, local florists, for a different one, resort packages, destination wedding planners, and travel coordinators, each pricing the exact same information gap in a new currency. Third barrier, what happens after you sign? The initial quote is rarely the final number. Service charges, gratuities, overtime fees once the reception runs past its contracted hour, cake cutting fees, delivery and setup fees, weather contingency fees for anything outdoors. Industry data puts these add-ons at 9 to 15% on top of the number you thought you'd agreed to. A markup that arrives after the deposit is already non-refundable. And there's a fourth barrier, one that doesn't hit the couple at all. It hits the vendor. To get in front of a couple who's ready to spend $30,000+, most small wedding businesses today don't rely on walking foot traffic. They rent visibility from a marketplace. And in this industry, there are effectively two marketplaces that matter, reaching a combined 43 to 45 million monthly visitors, and a listing on either one typically starts at several $100s a month, often locked into a 12-month contract before a single lead has converted into an actual booking. Which raises a question worth sitting with for a second. If both the biggest platforms a vendor can advertise on happen to answer to the same owner, who's actually setting the price of getting discovered in the first place? There's a fifth cost, and it's the one almost nobody itemizes: your own labor. Somewhere in the middle of negotiating 12 separate contracts, most couples become unpaid project managers for an event they've never run before, coordinating vendors who've each run hundreds. It's no accident that couples are increasingly turning to software to close that gap. AI-assisted wedding planning tools saw adoption nearly double year over year, reaching 36% of couples by 2025. Not because the tools are cheaper, because the information gap between a first-time buyer and a full-time seller was wide enough that even a couple with a $34,000 budget needed help just leveling the playing field on their own purchase. Here's where the money actually moves. Start with the venue, because it's the single biggest line item in almost every wedding. Again, 24 to 40% of total spend. Increasingly, that venue isn't a one-off family-owned barn or ballroom. Private equity has been quietly rolling up wedding venues the same way it rolled up veterinary clinics and dental practices, buying standalone properties and consolidating them under one operating company that standardizes pricing, packages, and staffing across dozens of locations. One national operator alone now runs more than 75 venues under a single brand. To you, it looks like a charming property with a view. To its owners, it's one node in a portfolio designed to extract a consistent margin from a category where demand doesn't really shrink. No matter what the economy does, people keep getting married. That venue math also explains why the roll-up model works so cleanly here compared to almost any other category on this channel. A gym membership can be canceled. A car rental can be shopped around 30 different competitors on any given weekend. A wedding venue, once booked, is locked to one specific Saturday, one specific guest count, one specific couple who have already told 200 people to save that date. There is no walking away and rebooking a competitor 2 weeks later. That's the kind of built-in customer lock-in that private equity models love, and it's exactly why a single operator scaling to over 75 venues nationally can standardize pricing tiers, catering minimums, and vendor referral kickbacks across its entire portfolio, the same way a hospital roll-up standardizes billing codes across 75 emergency rooms. Now the platforms. The two names virtually every American couple types into a search bar, the Knot and WeddingWire, are, in fact, the same company. They merged in a deal worth nearly $1 billion, backed by two private equity firms, and now operate under one parent, the Knot Worldwide. That company doesn't cater a single meal, shoot a single photo, or arrange a single flower. It sells access. Across its platforms, it claims 43 to 45 million monthly visitors, and in 2024 alone, it says it delivered 9 million leads to vendors, connecting roughly 4 million couples with 900,000 vendors globally and facilitating an estimated $4 billion in spending in a single year. It collects revenue whether or not any individual lead ever turns into a booked wedding. That distinction matters, because vendors are starting to say so publicly. One wedding photographer's 8-year record on WeddingWire tells the story in numbers. In his first year, he paid $1,500 and booked 15 weddings off the platform. By his 8th year, he was paying $3,600 a year for exactly 2 bookings, with roughly 95% of inquiries never responding to a single follow-up message. His own personal website, by contrast, converted about 95% of the people who reached out. The platform he was paying for converted somewhere around 5 to 10%. He kept paying anyway, because the platform still controlled the visibility. That gap between what a listing costs and what it delivers has drawn regulatory attention. A nationwide class action was filed against the Knot Worldwide in April 2025, alleging the company knowingly supplied vendors with fraudulent or low-quality leads. More than 200 complaints have reportedly reached the Federal Trade Commission since 2018, and at least one U.S. senator has publicly urged a federal investigation. The company disputes the allegations. So the machine works like this. A couple pays retail markup to vendors who are themselves paying rent to a duopoly platform for the privilege of being found, and every layer of that stack collects its cut whether the couple's wedding day goes perfectly or falls apart by noon. Zoom into a single vendor category, and the same structure repeats at a smaller scale. Take live music. A quality 4-piece live band typically commands $4,000 to $10,000 for reception coverage. A professional DJ delivers a comparable energy level for $1,500 to $2,800. Couples increasingly make that swap, not because they love the DJ format more, but because the price gap is large enough to fund an upgrade somewhere else in the stack. Usually photography or florals, the two categories couples say they regret cutting the most after the fact. That single substitution, multiplied across 2 million weddings a year, is effectively a $2,000 to $4,000 transfer of spending power away from live musicians and toward photographers and florists, a shift nobody planned centrally, but one the aggregate data shows happening anyway. One more layer sits underneath all of it, and it's the layer most couples never question at all, the ring that starts the entire process. The average American engagement ring cost roughly $6,500 in 2025. That price sits on top of a standard jewelry retail structure, keystone pricing, meaning the retail price is simply double the wholesale cost, with many retailers now pricing at triple wholesale to cover overhead, staff, and inventory risk. It's worth noticing that this markup isn't wedding-specific at all. It's the same margin structure jewelry stores apply to a necklace bought for no occasion whatsoever. The emotional weight of the purchase doesn't change the math. It just makes couples far less likely to negotiate it. Add it all up, and the wedding day cash flow splits into two very different categories of business. One category, the florist, the photographer, the small independent venue, the local band, takes on all the labor, all the delivery risk, and all the reputational exposure of a single irreplaceable day, in exchange for a one-time payment. The other category, the platform selling visibility, the consolidator owning the real estate, the wholesaler pricing the ring and the gown, collects a recurring or structural margin regardless of how any single wedding actually turns out. Both categories call themselves the wedding industry. Only one of them is actually exposed to whether your wedding goes well. That same pattern, an ordinary retail structure wrapped in a once-in-a-lifetime purchase, is exactly what determined whether the next business in this chain would survive. Now the case study, because nothing exposes how an industry actually works like watching a piece of it collapse in real time. David's Bridal opened its doors in 1950, and for decades it was the default American wedding dress shop. Accessible pricing, hundreds of locations, the place where a huge share of American brides bought their gowns. Then, in 2012, a private equity firm bought the company and loaded it with debt through a leveraged buyout. The same financial structure that has since taken down department store chains, toy retailers, and hospital systems. Acquire the company using borrowed money secured against the company itself, then require it to service that debt regardless of how the underlying business actually performs that year. 6 years later, in 2018, the debt caught up with it. David's Bridal filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the first time, restructured roughly $400 million in obligations, and emerged in 2019, leaner, but still carrying the scars of the buyout. Notice what didn't happen in between. Demand didn't collapse. Roughly 2 million American weddings still happened every single year through this entire timeline. What collapsed was the company's ability to carry its financing structure while operating a brick-and-mortar footprint that assumed every one of those brides would walk into a physical store. David's Bridal wasn't competing only against other bridal retailers anymore. It was competing against a growing option its own balance sheet couldn't offer. Buying the same style of dress online, secondhand, or through a rental service, at a fraction of the markup, without ever setting foot in a mall. Then came the part nobody had modeled, a pandemic that shut down in-person shopping entirely, while rent kept accruing on roughly 300 leased retail locations across the country and its factories sat idle. Even after stores reopened, the customer base had shifted underneath the business. Couples marrying later in life, planning smaller weddings, and increasingly buying dresses online or secondhand instead of walking into a mall storefront built for an earlier, bigger spending generation of brides. By April 2023, the math no longer worked. The company filed a notice warning of up to 9,326 layoffs across its roughly 300 stores, rolling out in waves from April through August. On April 17, 2023, just 73 years after it opened, David's Bridal filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for the second time in 5 years. Court filings showed $257 million in debt against just $4.4 million in cash on hand. CEO James Markham cited the post-COVID environment and uncertain economic conditions. The structural story underneath that statement was simpler: a debt-loaded, mall-anchored retail footprint built for a wedding market that had already started moving somewhere else. The ending wasn't total liquidation, but it wasn't a rescue either. A bankruptcy court approved a sale to an asset management firm, which invested $20 million, assumed select liabilities, and kept up to 195 of the original roughly 300 stores running, preserving about 7,000 of the original jobs. Rival bidders wouldn't offer more than $250,000 in cash just for the brand's intellectual property, and none of them would commit to keeping stores open at all. As the bankruptcy judge put it on the record, it was essentially this deal or nothing. Compare the two numbers from that court filing one more time. $257 million owed, for $0.4 million in the bank. That's not a company that ran out of customers. That's a company where every dollar walking through the door was already spoken for before it arrived. Rent on 300 stores, debt service from a decade-old buyout, and payroll for a workforce that would shortly be cut by more than 9,000 people. The wedding still happened for every one of those brides. The company built to sell them a dress didn't survive long enough to see most of those weddings take place. David's Bridal didn't fail because demand for wedding dresses disappeared. 2 million weddings still happened in America that year, and every year since. It failed because a financial structure imposed fixed, unforgiving payments onto a business whose physical footprint, hundreds of leased stores built for in-person shopping, was already becoming a mismatch for how the next generation of brides actually wanted to buy a dress. So line up everyone standing around that $34,000 average and ask who's actually guaranteed to come out ahead. The Knot worldwide wins independent of any single vendor's outcome. Whether a photographer books the lead or not, the listing fee is already collected. Whether a couple ever contacts a florist through the platform, the vendor's monthly payment is already due. The venue consolidators win by owning the category's single biggest line item, 24 to 40% of every wedding budget, and standardizing it into a repeatable, portfolio-wide margin. The same roll-up logic behind every private equity-owned category this channel has already covered: dental practices, veterinary clinics, nursing homes. Layer that against the vendor fee data from earlier, a lead gen platform collecting revenue whether a booking happens or not, a venue consolidator locking in a portfolio-wide margin regardless of which specific couple shows up, and a pattern emerges. The businesses that win hardest in this industry are the ones furthest from the actual wedding day, the ones selling access, real estate, or wholesale inventory, rather than the ones standing in the room delivering the service the couple actually remembers. The wholesale suppliers of flowers, gowns, and diamonds largely win on ordinary retail markup, the kind that exists in any retail category, wedding or not. That's worth saying plainly, because the popular myth of a giant, secret wedding tax often obscures a more boring truth. A meaningful share of what looks like wedding-specific price gouging is just standard markup, with extra labor and extra risk priced on top of it. Who doesn't reliably win? The individual vendor, renting access to a lead generation duopoly for hundreds of dollars a month under a mandatory annual contract, converting a reported 5 to 10% of the leads they're paying for. And the couple, 67% of whom, according to one 2025 lender survey, take on debt to pay for a single day that, by definition, cannot be discounted, resold, or repeated if it doesn't go as planned. Of that group, less than two-thirds had paid the debt off by the time they were surveyed, and nearly half said they wouldn't be caught up for at least another 6 months. 23% called money the single most stressful part of the entire experience, and 16% said budget disagreements made them consider calling off the wedding altogether before it even happened. Everyone in this chain transacts differently, and that difference is the whole story. The platforms and the consolidators transact millions of times a year, refining pricing and conversion with every single one. The vendor transacts dozens of times a season. The couple transacts exactly once, with no prior data, no repeat customer discount, and no way to A/B test their own wedding. Go back to that florist quote. $1,200. She never actually lied to you. She priced a Saturday in June the same way an airline prices the last open seat before a flight departs. Because for that one specific date, that exact arrangement only sells once to one couple, and then it's gone. That's not a conspiracy. That's what a market looks like when 2 million buyers show up exactly one time each, negotiating against a system of intermediaries who show up 10,000 times a year and have priced every single one of those transactions before the couple even picked up the phone. So the question isn't really whether the wedding industry is rigged. The question is who's actually placing the bet. You, spending on something you will do exactly once in your life. Or a marketplace platform, running the identical play 45 million times a month. Is $34,000 the price of a memory? Or the price of being the newest player at a table everyone else has already been sitting at for years? Either way, the toast still happens. The photos still get taken. Somewhere in a filing cabinet, or more likely a server rack. A platform logs one more converted lead, a venue closes out one more Saturday, and a couple, for the first and only time, calls it priceless.